My name is Sojourner Truth. You know, I was up in heaven, and the doorbell rang. I went to the door, and there was a messenger from God, and he said, God said for you to come quick. So I went. And God said to me, I want you to go down on earth this morning because Reverend Eleanor at the Unity Church is sick. And she asked Sylvia Walker to do the sermon. And Sylvia's down on her knees praying for help. And she's praying, and I want to answer her prayer. So there have been times when she's spoken about you. So why don't you go down and get inside of her and tell your story about prayer? And I said, but God, she doesn't look anything like me. And she wears those loud colors and sometimes flashy hats. And he said, I promise you, I'll tone her down. And she'll wear something conservative. So I said, but suppose I startle her. And he said, she sleeps through the sermons and the meditations. She won't even know you're there. So you saw I was sitting here waiting for the Lord's Prayer, and then I jumped inside. And no, this body, I didn't look nothing like this. I wasn't fat, and I'm 6 foot tall, and very skinny. I don't have these big hips like this gal has. And I'm very black. And I was born in 1798. And I'm going to tell you about prayer and what prayer can do for you. I was born in New York State in New Platts. Now, in 1817, New York State passed a law, and it said that all slaves over the age of 25 female and 28 male would be set free on the 4th of July in 1828. Well, that was great, but it was sad because slaves didn't have no birth certificates. And we had to rely on the masters to tell us how old we are so we could get free. So my mama, when I was a little girl, see, I was sold away from my family when I was 8. I was the last of 5 of my parents' children to be sold off. And my mama would say, there's a God up there in the sky. And when you have a problem, you look up into the sky and you pray, and God will answer your prayers if you have faith. She said, sometimes he doesn't answer all of them. But if you pray hard enough, and it's a big enough thing, it'll be answered. So when I heard this news about getting freed at 25, I went to my special place out on the farm, and I would sit and I would meditate and I would pray to the Lord. I hope I'm 25. I hope I'm 25. So that I could leave. Well, the master called me and he said, you have been such a faithful servant, I'm going to let you go early, a year early. And when the time came, he said, you didn't work hard enough. Because, see, I had cut my hand with a sickle. But I still did all my chores. I did more than my chores. He said, you have to wait until the harvest because I need you. So I went out and I prayed. And I prayed, and God told me to leave. So I had a small infant. I had 5 other children, but they were grown and some of them sold off. But I worried about my infants, so I got up early in the morning before the sun came up, and I just took my baby and I walked down the road. And I came to some Quakers' house, and those Quakers, they were nice people, and they took me in. Well, then the master came with the horse and wagon, and he stood out there and he hollered, Isabella, Isabella, because Isabella was my name. Isabella Dumont. See, the slaves took the name of their masters, so I was Dumont. I can't tell you how many names because I was sold off long before this rule came. He called me, and the Quaker man, he went out and he said, she's not coming out. He said, get her out here. Well, I was inside praying, and I went outside and I said, I'm not getting in that wagon. He said, get in this wagon. I said, the Lord told me I didn't have to go, and I'm not going. And do you know what? That Quaker man, he paid my master $25 for me and my baby. And my master was satisfied. $25 was a lot of money in those days. And so he went on, and I stayed with those people until I worked off the $25. Now, they liked my baby, and they took good care of him. Now, I had another son who was 5 years old, and I said, I'm going to find him. And so I went and traveled to the farm where he had been sold to, and I knocked on the door, and I asked about him, and the lady said, what? You in here worrying about some little nigger? He's off in Kentucky with my daughter. He's her lap slave, and she got married, and he's gone. Well, there was also a law that said it was against the law for a master to sell his slave across the state line in order to avoid setting them free. So I prayed. I went in my little corner, and I prayed, and I talked to God, and God talked to me, and God said, go to the courthouse. Now, you know, slaves couldn't go to the courthouse. Women didn't even go to the courthouse. And so I went, and I stood there. I didn't have shoes on my feet. You know, I didn't have shoes in New York State until I was 28 years old. And I stood there in the courthouse, and I asked for help. And somebody said, oh, there's a lawyer down the street. He'll help you. And he did. And he took my case, and we went to court, and the judge gave me back my son. Prayer works. I got my son, and we went to New York City, and somebody took him and put him into a boarding school where he learned how to be a seaman. And later on, he went off to sea as a cabin boy. But they didn't have a whole lot of rules on those ships, and I never, ever saw my son again. But what I did was I joined the church. See, I didn't know nothing about Jesus. I just knew about God. So I was passing this church, and people were singing and shouting, and so I went in. They were beating on the tambourine, and on Monday, they would go in the red light district, and they would try and get them gals to do good and to come to church. Well, eventually, they got them. They would come to church on Sunday, and they'd be hanging out the window on Monday. Well, they beat on the tambourine and carry on, so I decided, I said, I don't like all that shouting and falling out. But they was praying for me. And a woman next to me, she got the spirit, and she fell on me. And I fell on the ground with my leg twisted up under me, and I was, ah, ah, and everybody said, she got the spirit, she got the spirit. Well, I said, this ain't doing nothing. This is not what Jesus wants. He wants us to get out there and do something. So there was another gentleman in the church. He was all about meditation, and that was right up my alley. So he decided to start a commune. So I joined the commune, and eventually I became his housekeeper. And we'd have our services, and one day there was a knock on the door. I opened up the door, and there was this man in a long gown and a long hair. And he said, "I am Mattathias." I was like, "Do tell." I didn't know. You see, I couldn't read and write. I didn't know what was in the Bible except what somebody told me. So I said, "Come on in." So he came in, and him and this gentleman, they decided that they would be partners. And they both had wives. And let me tell you, they was partners because after a while, they started trading wives. And then one man shot the other one. And there I was in the paper as the main instigator of these swapping beds. The only time I ever saw a bed was when I was making them. I was so busy taking care of the commune. Well, I had a name and a reputation, so I went and prayed. I said, "Lord, what am I going to do about my reputation?" And it came to me. I went back to court. I sued the paper, and I won my case. See, there ain't nothing that you can't do that there's a rule or a law. If you look hard enough, you will find the answer. So that's what I did. I sued the paper. So then I decided I had to leave, and I was going to go somewhere else. So I went down the road. In my little travels, I would wash clothes or help with babies and things, and I just worked my way from town to town. And I discovered something. I decided that I was going to have to preach to white people. So when I'd pass and I'd hear a church, I'd go into church, and I'd sit down, and I discovered that white people like to hear black people sing. So when people would get up to testify, I would stand up and sing, "He arose, he arose, he arose on Calvary." Well, people would turn around, because I was sitting in the back, to see who this was, and they see this tall, skinny black woman standing there. And then I would testify about what it would be like to be a slave. And I said, if you want to go to heaven and meet your maker, you got to free the slaves. You can't have slavery. You got to get rid of it. And then I went from church to church. Then I decided, you know, I'm going to make this my life. And so I decided that I was going to sojourn up and down the land. And I was going to change my name to what I wanted it to be. So I changed my name to Sojourner and my last name to Truth, because Jesus was truth and Jesus was my master. So I became Sojourner Truth. And I went up and down the land talking about slavery. I joined the abolitionist movement. I went around giving speeches. And then I joined the suffragettes. Then the Civil War came along. And after the war and during the war, things were just terrible. All of these black people came from the South into the city of Washington. They were refugees running away from the war. They were all over the street. They were nasty. They were dirty. They were hungry. And I went and prayed. And the Lord said to me, "Go see Lincoln." So I went to the White House, knocked on the door. I said, "I'm here to see Lincoln. I'm Sojourner Truth." And the man thought, this black woman is crazy, or she really needs to see Lincoln. Before you know it, my prayers were answered. I was in there talking to Abraham Lincoln. And I told him something had to be done. And you know what he did? He made me in charge of the refugees. I ended up working for the United States Army, The Union Army, it wasn't United States too much then. Some of them states had separated. But I worked. And I made a change. I had a warehouse. And I put the people in the warehouse, and I went around my horse and wagon trying to collect food. And it worked out just fine. Now, all of this is over, and time passed. And I got old. Somebody wrote down my story because I couldn't read and write. And then I kept on going and talking this time about where's them 40 acres and a mule that we're supposed to be getting. And I prayed. And the Lord didn't tell me go see Lincoln because Lincoln was gone. But I went and saw Senator Sumner. And I said, you know, that state called Kansas, it ain't too populated. Why don't you give us some mules and send us to Kansas? And he said, well, I got to have to know that the people really want this to happen. So he said, give me some signatures. I walked up and down the land for 3 years. I collected 3,000 signatures. And I went back to Washington, and when I got there, Senator Sumner had died. Well, the signatures just sat in the corner to dust. There never was any Kansas. But I lived to be an old woman, sore and sick. And I prayed, and the Lord sent me to see Dr. Kellogg. You know that one that was, his brother did them cornflakes. He was doing Wheaties and Post-'em. Well, I went, and he gave me some of this stuff, and I got well, and I lived to be 83 years old. And that is my story about prayer. And now, she's coming out of trance. So I got to disappear and go back to heaven. Bye-bye.